Good morning. I'm Guy Rolnick from Booth, and thank you for joining us. And as you can see from today's program and our keynote speaker, it gets better every hour. So I have the privilege and the honor to introduce the keynote speaker for this morning, Mario Monti. Mario Monti is the president of Bocconi University, Milan, and a senator for life of the Italian Republic. He was Prime Minister of Italy between November 2011 to April 2013. And before that, he served for 10 years as a member of the European Commission in various roles. First as Commissioner for Internal Market, Services, Customs and Taxation, which he served, and then as a Commissioner for Competition between 1999 and 2004. As Competition Commissioner, Monti is known, among other things, for pursuing Microsoft, for attempting to abuse the dominant market position of Windows to go into other markets as part of the European Antitrust investigation into Microsoft's conduct, and ordering the company to pay a then record fine of €500 million. A news article from that point coined his term as competition commissioner, said that Monti was most famous for shooting mergers down in flames. He led the European Commission investigation into a number of very prominent mergers, among them General Electric and Honeywell. Mr. Monti also chaired the high-level group, a joint effort of the European Parliament, European Commission, and European Council that published last year a report on the future of the EU finances. He is the honorary president of the Brussels-based think tank Bruegel, which he founded in 2005, a member of the Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques in Paris, and chairman of the European Advisory Board of Transparency International. Mr. Monti, please.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for that introduction, which had the delicacy of sparing one epithet, which I think was in The Economist at that time, that I was considered to be the Saddam Hussein of corporate capitalism. Which squared somewhat imperfectly with some criticisms when I was appointed Prime Minister in some sectors of the Italian Parliament that I was brought there simply as a servant to global capitalism. I used to be an academic economist. I used to be a competition enforcer. I used to run a government. This makes me eminently disqualified to advance the debate at this conference in terms of depth. All I can hope to do is to provide some contextual observations based also on personal experiences that might address the question that Luigi Zingales put to me when inviting me. The question was, why is the EU more aggressive than the US in competition policy? And I should add that when that question comes from the American side, it is normally associated explicitly or implicitly with the question, does the EU use its antitrust powers for protectionism? My view, in a nutshell, is that the European Commission as a competition enforcer does tend to be more vigorous than, on average, the US antitrust agencies. It is not protectionist. There are reasons, however, in my view, which tend to create this perception of protectionism. These will require great care, great attention in the years to come in view of this conference, namely in view of the fact that we will have to expect more enforcement vis-à-vis the big tech companies, and they tend to be American-based, and the psychology of the dividing line between antitrust and trade policy or protectionism will be particularly fine and delicate, particularly if one or both jurisdictions are tending towards words and maybe facts of trade war. So I should first of all say that the cooperation, internationally speaking in general, and particularly across the Atlantic, is at an unprecedented level. And this comes out in every discussion and in every presentation by Macon Delrahim and Margareta Vestager. I witnessed times when the cooperation was in a nascent phase, but bumped into quite strong obstacles following one or two decisions that were seen to be strong collisions. I would like to inspect with you briefly what are the institutional, the political reasons why the EU is probably more powerful in terms of competition policy and is certainly more consistent over time and over space than their American colleagues. Quite powerful because in a weak united Europe, which is not united yet, we all know, since the very beginning, competition policy, since the Rome Treaty of 1957, even before the 1954 Paris Treaty setting up the first nucleus of the EU, namely the European Steel and Coal Community, competition was seen to be key. The powers were assigned to a central entity, the European Commission, and there were very few other policy areas in which that was done. Actually, only trade policy at that time. Trade policy where the degree of say by the member states relative to the Commission has, however, been increasing in last few years. Then, of course, there has been historically a second junior but quite powerful point of federal decisions that came much later with the single currency and the European Central Bank. But as a matter of fact, competition policy and monetary policy are the two areas where Europe is federal. In both cases, I find it extremely interesting to note that this happened under American influence, because the concern by the Americans in the occupation phase after World War II of Germany was understandably, number one, to avoid the formation of trusts again, those which were conducive to World War II, and number two, to prevent the insurgence of hyperinflation again, which was another factor conducing to World War II. And how can you try to do that? Well, with a antitrust or cartel or competition institution, somewhat model on the American laws, and with a strong independent central bank, the Bundesbank, somewhat modeled, not perfectly, but somewhat modeled on the Fed. So it was America that helped us to become strong in those two areas, even though sometimes the concrete fruits of that strength might displease a bit our American friends. In this high power policy area, which is competition policy, the decisions taken by the Commission in the area of cartels, dominance of abuses of dominance, state aid, have immediate executive powers. It is for the parties, and the parties may also be a member state of the EU in state aid control, to go to the court if they do not agree with the decision of the Commission. But until the court eventually annuls the Commission decision has been active in the ground of the reality. In other areas, the Commission powers are extremely more limited, and I experienced myself the two extremes, competition policy and, luckily enough, in my first term, not in my second term, the much weaker situation of being in charge of the single market, where if you find a member state putting an illegal obstacle to free movement or something, the Commission has to go to the court. It may take 3, 4, 5 years, and if it does win at the end, it is only at the end that the obstacle is removed. Also, a reason for potency, in a sense, of the Commission decisions is institutional. The Competition Commissioner is one member of a college of 20, presently 28, a large college, a large collegial body, which is the Commission, which takes all decisions. This means that if the Commission is the executive of the EU, the Competition Commissioner is one of the ministers, in a sense. This also means that the degree of proximity of the competition activity commissioner and her services to all other policy areas is very great. If in the Commission a regulation is being debated on transportation, who will be the watchdog to make sure that there are no, maybe unintended, negative side effects on competition? The Competition Commissioner. In national setups, the national competition authorities throughout the world have an important competition advocacy. But that's normally exposed once the law is there. Here, in Brussels, if the Competition Commissioner is active, he or she can prevent ex ante a lot of damage. But of course, this needs to be asymmetrical, because if, on the other hand, the other commissioners who are considered to be less powerful and tend to be more political in their approach, were overly intrusive in the proposals that the Competition Commissioner brings to the table, that would be the end of the real and perceived independence of the competition policy. Now, why do I say that there is more consistency over time and over space? Well, I had a wonderful laboratory case in front of me when I started my activity in 2000, and that was indeed the Microsoft case. If we take a broad view of that case, we had one approach followed in the US by Joel Klein, the Justice Department under Clinton. Very tough, the breakup order, which was not followed by the court. Then came the Bush administration, another Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, an extremely soft settlement accepted by the DOJ. Probably also there is a sentence in the court okaying that settlement, that it was the post-September 11 climate and the business community needed to be, did not need other perturbations. The fact is that we had, a few years later, a similar Microsoft case here. I discussed a lot with Joel Klein and vice versa. We did not even imagine of going to the structural remedy. I'll say something in a few minutes to that effect for the future, after yesterday's discussion here. But our conclusion was considerably more vigorous than the DOJ, the Bush DOJ conclusion for Microsoft. So this points to some sort of political cycle, at least in that case, in the US. Of course, the examination should be much wider, but one can see several elements of political cycles. My observation after having carefully listened to Macon yesterday is that this is just a subjective interpretation, that I saw in him the most potentially vigorous Assistant Attorney General of Antitrust, for Antitrust, under the Republican administrations that I have seen so far. So in Europe, there is no electoral cycle, or to be more precise, there are electoral cycles in all our member states. Sometimes they coincide, sometimes they do not coincide. There is a mild 5-year electoral cycle in Europe itself with the election of the European Parliament, the influence of which on the stance of competition policy so far has been absolutely minimal. So even just only for statistical reasons and the law of great numbers, only the UK has given a recent contribution to decrease the applicability of that law of great numbers in the UK context. It's most unlikely that there is an electoral cycle affecting competition policy. And as to consistency over space, I must say I've always been struck by the amazingly imaginative and scarcely rational institutional structure of antitrust in the US, because it has been so since time immemorable, and few dare to believe that it might ever change in the future, that you have two federal enforcers, the DOJ Antitrust Division and the FTC, both highly qualified, eminently staffed, with no crystal clear division of competences between the two of them. And there are the 50 states attorney general. And in the Microsoft case, except that the FTC did not intervene because that was allocated to the DOJ, but then you might remember that it was a dance of the 50 states with the DOJ or against the DOJ. Now, in Europe, this simply could not happen. Why? Because there is a clear allocation rule of the cases between the national authorities and the European Commission. Not only that, but in 2004, Regulation 1/2003, which was effective in May 2004, the day of accession of the countries from Central and Eastern Europe, we vastly modified the institutional architecture of enforcing competition in Europe, also to avoid, I believe that was not entirely sufficient to dispel the concerns, that the new countries might simply feel a temporary breeze of having left Moscow, but then plunging into the influence of Brussels. And I did not want that, especially the tough decisions, because competition is rarely a pleasant decision for the people, especially in state aid control, the tough decisions would be seen as associated to Brussels. So that as they came in, they already started to operate in a network there and the Western national competition authorities with the European Commission, the European Competition Network. There are precise rules of allocation of the cases. So what happens from time to time in the US is simply not conceivable. In the Microsoft case, for example, I brought, once I considered the settlement proposed by Steve Ballmer, much better than the solution with the DOJ, but insufficient, especially to give legal clarity for the future. I prefer to run the risk of losing the case in the court, but of achieving some legal certainty, which hopefully might have shortened a bit the secularly long investigations in future cases of the internet economy. And so for that decision not to settle, but to take the negative decision with the fine, but above all with ordering some changes in the business model, all we had to do from the center was to put the proposed decision to the advisory committee meeting in Brussels with the representatives of all the national competition authorities. They agreed, but even if they didn't, we could have brought the proposal to the college. So during the modernization committee here in the US a few years ago, and here there are persons enormously knowledgeable, sometimes sitting in the last row of this place about all these evolutions, like Bill Kovacic. The Modernization Committee addressed also this problem of the architecture, but came to no conclusion. Maybe new times will come. From this I draw also, when I speak in Europe, a small consolation. Europe has so many problems, as you know, unlike the US, that I say, look, in Europe we are convinced most of the times, rightly, that we are so sclerotic in changing our structures, be it microeconomic structures, be it the structural reforms in member states, and also with the institutions. But that is not necessarily the case always. What is, I dare to say, the problem of achieving a merger or a new setup of two federal, both of them federal, competition authorities in Washington, relative to, on the paper, totally impossible achievement that was done in Europe of, I will not say eliminate national central banks, but drastically reducing their powers. This, in a much more sclerotic and conservative structure than the US, called Europe, was done for the most powerful, prestigious, and elegant institutions in each member state, the central banks. So when the dynamic of integration takes on, things may happen. Maybe the problem with the US is that it has been having for such a long time already a perfect integration. So the momentum of integrating is behind the EU. Let me round off with a couple of further remarks. Political power, lobbying. It was very interesting, the discussion yesterday here. Of course, lobbying exists wherever and does not know national borders. I must say that in the case of the US lobbying the EU in terms of competition policy, I can say that I have observed without any presumption a learning process, which is good. In the first major case which erupted, the GE-Honeywell merger, 2001, the Justice Department had already authorized that merger, and Jack Welch came to Brussels with the impression that it was a nice formality that would be greatly appreciated, that he paid a personal visit to the commissioner. That was very much appreciated. However, it didn't help. In the end, there are also some legendary anecdotes around them, but not for academic circles like this one. After some meetings, I had to say to Jack Welch in my office, look, you are putting desperate lobbying pressure on all my colleagues in the Commission and on all the national competition authorities. You must be aware that if you continue like this, you can only worsen your situation. And he immediately called from my office Andrew Cart, the Chief of Staff of President Bush. So that was, and in another case which came a few years later, precisely the Microsoft case, I must say that Bill Gates and then Steve Ballmer have tried to be much more respectful of the process. They have mobilized less the President and the Senate. In the previous case, President Bush made public statements against the eventuality that the EU would block the merger. And now I think even lobbying is taking place in more civilized and orderly ways. But this brings me to a reflection. I've always been, like any good Europhile, in favor of the principle of subsidiarity, namely you should take the decision the closest geographically to where the impact of the decision is felt. Yes, but when political and lobbying processes do exist, precisely the opposite may be valid. I've seen in many European cases that it is easier to arrive at a strong objective decision in a very hot competition policy, taking the decision from Brussels in a transparent way so that all the 28 are informed, rather than in a national capital. So this runs a bit against the principle of subsidiarity. I say so because concerning our topic, I wonder whether the role of the EU in the next years concerning American-based big tech will not take on a new, almost global function. I remember when we prohibited GE Honeywell, we were fustigated by the US press and the Congress. But there was one voice, Paul Krugman in the New York Times, who wrote an article saying, I don't see anything protectionist in that decision. I, for one, am glad that there is at least one competition authority around which takes seriously the duty of working for consumers. Now, of course, ideal would be to have those recognitions from highly authoritative personalities like his, probably coming from the right and the left, and without any potential accent in affecting the reader. But at any rate, we, and let me really conclude at this point, if we look at the big tech, now that precisely thanks to the initial divergences of the 2000s, we have done a lot of work in Europe. We have learned enormously from the US, not only over history, but also in giving a much greater role to economic analysis. When we hired the first chief competition economist, Lars Henrik Röller, that was in itself a power factor of coming closer together between DOJ, FTC, and the EU. And with some pride, I note that when Lars Henrik had to leave, because it is a one-term only function at the Commission, he was hired by Chancellor Merkel, and he has been since her economic advisor. So now the conditions are there in terms of understanding also about the economics of the cases for, I believe in the future, a greater, not a smaller convergence. And this will be badly needed in my view, because these huge big tech cases will have to be addressed by somebody. I would hate to see them addressed only or mainly by the European authorities, but the European authorities may be at a bit more arm's length relative to the interests of the industry here. And yesterday we heard what I perceived as a declining confidence in the pure behavioral remedies. So if we have to move to more structural remedies, well, first of all, Europe now has formally the power to do that, like the US, again under Regulation 1/2003. Europe, in a sense, already used a structural remedy vis-à-vis two American companies, but a virtual structural remedy, because when we prohibited GE Honeywell, the deal did not go through, even in the US, because taking the European market away would undermine the economic rationale. So in a sense, we intervened, imposing, affecting the landscape, because a company which should have been born was not born. But suppose it is an existing big tech company, I would much prefer as a European that if there is any structural decision to be made, it will be made together or on the same page by the US and European authorities. And I believe that we will, if antitrust has a future, we will have to see some of these cases going ahead. And in an era which is affected with the germs of trade wars, I think it will be extremely important even to set up some informal ex-ante mechanism of cooling off of the almost inevitable tensions, some pedagogical exercise explaining to the public opinions and to the interested parties that it must be possible to do incisive, vigorous, I don't like the term aggressive, antitrust without that being taken for trade wars. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you.